So now we know that economic growth is key when we have to decide whether to go in equities or in bonds. But there's another dimension which needs to be added here, and that's inflation. And this is done here with this following chart. You see here two compasses. The one on the left is from a famous browser, and the one on the right, is one which I personally very much like. And you see the difference here is that the red arrow points to the northeast for the compass on the left, but to the northwest for the compass on the right. And why is this so? So let's imagine the following. You look at the compass on the right, and you assume that on the vertical axis we measure growth, and on the horizontal axis we measure inflation. Okay. So now let's assume that we're going in the quadrant to the top on the right. In there, we will have a lot of inflation and we will have a lot of growth. So this is an overheating economy. Economic growth is too strong and eventually it produces inflation. To the point where this higher inflation actually slows down the economy. And so we go to the quadrant which is on the right still, but on the bottom, where we have a lot of inflation, but no growth, or very little growth, or possibly even negative growth. And that's called stagflation, a combination of stagnation and inflation. This is the example of Brazil currently. They have lots of inflation and they have no growth or high unemployment. The worst of all is the quadrant on the left and the bottom. This is the deflation, where you have no growth and no inflation or negative inflation. Luckily, there are not many examples of this deflation. The last that we are aware of is the Great Depression in the US and elsewhere. So we may view this deflation quadrant actually with two subcategories. One is where the economy is cooling, and the other one where the economy is too cold. Now, the perfect quadrant, and this is why the red arrow is pointing in that direction, is the quadrant where to the left on the top, because that's where you have little inflation and strong growth. And indeed, this scenario of perfection with a lot of growth and no inflation is the ideal one for equity market. And it's actually called, it bears a name, it's called the Goldilocks scenario. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Goldilocks, Boucle d'Or. Goldilocks is that little blonde girl, and she gets lost in the woods, and she finds this house all lit. She walks in, and she finds these 3 cups on the table. In the English version, I think it's actually porridge. In the French version, it's chocolate, hot chocolate. So she goes for a big bowl, the largest one, and that's for Daddy Bear. And she tastes it, and she says, "Ooh, way too hot." And then she goes for the one of the mummy bear, because it's the house of the 3 bears. I forgot to mention that. And so she tastes it, and it goes, it's way too cold. And then she goes for the one of the baby bear, and she takes the cup, drinks it, and it's just perfect. It's not too hot, not too cold, just perfect. And this is this ideal scenario for equity market, where the economy is not too hot, so that this economic growth produces inflation, which leads central banks to tighten monetary policy and increase interest rates, which equity market totally dislike. So it's not too hot, it's not too cold, where the economy is not growing enough for companies to generate profits. It's just perfect. You get enough growth, but not too much growth that brings inflation. So it's just the perfect scenario. And this is actually, as we will see in a minute, the scenario where equity markets perform best. So if we summarize what we've seen here, and we start with the quadrant of rising growth and rising inflation, meaning that the economy is warming, eventually this warming ends up in overheating and too hot, and this is with rising inflation and falling growth, which we've seen can also be called stagflation. The cooling and too cold, that's the worst of all scenarios. This is the deflation scenario, and the rising growth and falling inflation is perfection. We can fine-tune these 4 quadrants into 5 regime. Again, starting with the quadrant on the top right. We start with a rising growth regime. We have inflation picking up, and it slows down growth to the point where it gets too hot, and we have rising inflation choking off growth. And then the cooling comes when growth falls further and brings inflation along. And the just right, again, is positive growth and low inflation. And indeed, here we see how the equity markets have been performing in these 5 different regimes. And we see that the warming regime is the most frequent one, occurring 46% of the times, and generating a real performance of the equity market of 7.5% per annum. And you see here that the highest return is actually the one for perfection, as I just said, the Goldilocks scenario, generating more than 14% on a yearly basis. This is in real terms, this is after inflation. The cooling is still giving you some decent returns, but the too hot and too cold scenarios are very bad, especially obviously the too cold one, which is the outright deflation, where equity market tumbles by more than 20% per annum. In conclusion, we know that emerging markets typically face stronger growth, economic growth, but this stronger economic growth does not necessarily mean that you will find also high equity market returns. Indeed, economic growth is a key factor to look at when you have to decide whether to be in equities or in bonds. But the picture is only complete when you bring inflation into the scene. And when we look at the growth-inflation mix, we find out that the best mix is obviously the one of strong growth, low inflation mix, which we called Goldilocks, as we've seen. And this is where equity markets perform best.